Senator Feingold's political biography reflects an almost boundless amount of courage. Examples: he was the only Democratic senator to vote against a motion to dismiss Congress's impeachment case against President Clinton, arguing that House prosecutors should have, quote, every opportunity to prove that Clinton should be removed from office. In 2009, he was one of only 3 Democrats to vote against the confirmation of Tim Geithner to be Secretary of the Treasury. He co-sponsored the McCain-Feingold Campaign Reform Act, which took 7 years to pass, and which would have a far greater positive impact on the role of money in elected politics were it not for the bad old Supreme Court. He was one of only 23 senators who voted against authorizing President Bush to begin war in Iraq. In 2006, Senator Feingold introduced a resolution to censure President Bush for the illegal use of wiretapping, an effort which gathered the support of only 3 co-sponsors. In 1993, he announced his support for a single-payer model of national health care. In 2006, he announced his support for gay marriage. Senator Feingold is the richly deserving recipient of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. For all of that, the voters of the state of Wisconsin rejected him in 2010. What the hell is the matter with those people? Now, I thought about that a little bit, and there's obviously something wrong with them. It was clear to me that they need help. Now, think about this. In our society, we have all kinds of groups of people who have debilitating problems. We have alcoholics, we have drug abusers, we have sex addicts, we even have shopaholics. And for all of them, we have rehabilitation programs. But we don't have any for errant voters. Here's my proposition. Here's my proposal. What we should do is to create a new facility to help those voters who have clearly lost their way. And I think it should be called the Russell D. Feingold Voter Rehabilitation Center. Finally, it should be a very large facility, because in any election cycle, about half the country loses its way. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted and I am honored to introduce to you a man of great courage, Senator Russ Feingold.
Thank you very much, Professor Mott, for the nice introduction. And while disassociating myself from the characterization of the people of Wisconsin as needing a facility of that kind, let me say that I have heard so much about your wonderful career as one of the great teachers, not only here but across this country, and I congratulate you on your career. My thanks to President Riggs for her kindness and her leadership here, and especially to Jeff Blavatt, who has just been incredible in his welcoming and facilitating this trip today that has been fun already, and I know will continue to be. You know, it really is a thrill to be here. I suppose you're kind of used to being around this place, but for those of us that don't think about Gettysburg all the time, the movie Lincoln really reminded us of the incredible legacy of this place. At a time of partisanship and the inability of the country to remember our great legacies and the times when we've come together, this is a symbol both of division and of unity and accomplishment and healing. And we always say each generation has to be taught the lessons of the past. And that's true. Every generation has to learn about Lincoln and what happened. But what I realized when I saw that movie is your own generation, as you go through each decade, has to be retaught the same lessons of Abraham Lincoln, that conflict, and what happened in this community when the greatest speech in American history was delivered on this ground. So it's a special place to all of us. The same thing goes for Gettysburg College itself. Its abolitionist origins, its role in the Civil War, but especially its vibrant present. I've been on a lot of college campuses in the last couple of years having very good experiences like this. I want you to know that the enthusiasm and the vibrancy I feel here today is very high on the list. There is a real energy here. The students here and the faculty and all the staff are clearly pulling together to do something very special here. So I'm very happy to have learned about it. I also want to mention the legacy of Dwight Eisenhower. I'm of that age where he was the first president that I knew what a president was. And I thought, what a long name. But as I got older, I understood that he wasn't sort of a ideologically driven extremist. He was the guy that warned our nation about the danger of the industrial military complex, something that I've quoted almost more often than anything in my whole career. I didn't understand when I was at that age, 7, that he couldn't run again. So this guy named John F. Kennedy ran. And I was excited in 2nd grade. I already had the political bug. And I managed to collect 24 buttons that I wore to 2nd grade every day. I was little then, even littler then. And it weighted me down. And my teacher decided to have a poll in the class in 1960 as Ike was getting ready to leave office. And the day before the election, we had the vote. And the vote was 24-2. 24 for Nixon, 2 for Kennedy. One of them was my teacher, her name, Mrs. Kennedy. I went home crying, but I came back the next day. Kennedy had been elected. So I remember the days of Eisenhower and Kennedy, and it is good to be here to think about that as well. I want to especially thank the Blavatt family for your warmness, your kindness, your generosity in making this possible. It is truly an honor to be here to give the 15th lecture. Thank you so much. Now, I said in response to some of the requests about what I would talk about, that I primarily talk about this book, While America Sleeps. But I'm going to leave a little time at the end to say a bit, as requested, about campaign finance reform and the Citizens United case. My friend John McCain always likes saying that people in Wisconsin think my first name is McCain. He thinks that's a funny joke because of the McCain-Feingold bill. But the fact is, the Citizens United decision was devastating, and I created a group called Progressives United to fight it, and I have with me the chair of the group, who used to be my chief of staff, Mary Irvine, who is with me this evening as well. Let me talk a bit about the book and how it came to be. After the election, I was given an offer, sort of unsolicited by Random House, to write a book. And I said, what do you want me to write a book about? And they basically said, we don't care. We just need 100,000 words in 8 months. I said, okay. I'd never written a book. And I thought, what am I going to write about? Well, you might have thought that I had written about campaign finance reform or civil liberties, an incredibly strong interest in Africa. But I thought, I'll never get a chance probably to do this again. And so what is something I want to say that hasn't really been said? What is it that really sort of, in effect, keeps me up at night in terms of what's being ignored in this country that isn't getting enough conversation? And I'll tell you, what was bothering me then and what's bothering me now is I think that somehow, after 9/11, 10 years after 9/11, we have somehow forgotten the lessons of 9/11 with respect to making sure we change our course and become more connected in a serious way to the rest of the world. I think we've pulled back in. And that is the message that I wanted to convey. Our failure to stay focused on these issues, I think, is dangerous. You know, it's partly understandable. I mean, any country that goes through this kind of economic dislocation we've had since 2008 is going to look within. It's going to look at its domestic issues, its economic problems, and maybe not pay as much attention as it should to international problems. But what I thought 9/11 showed us was what happens when we're not alert. What it feels like to be taken completely by surprise. That was an emotion that I think many of us felt on that day. And so if you've got a better cliche, I'm happy to take it. But it's this. When it comes to looking at international as well as domestic issues, we have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't say, well, we'll get our economic house in order, we'll get employment going, we'll get jobs going, we'll get all that stuff, so then we'll go back to worrying about the rest of the world. No, that's how you end up in a lot of trouble. And instead, we have something very different. We have a government and a public at large that are really divided against themselves. We refuse to come together to solve obvious problems. We have gridlock, we have partisanship. We have obsession with the next election or even the next primary. They're already talking about who's going to run in 2016. Don't people get like a few weeks off from this thing? We have the corrupting influence of big money in politics. It reminds me of the words of Bob Dylan in a song called Blind Willie McTell, in which he wrote, "Power and greed and corruptible seed seem to be all that there is." And yes, as I discussed in the book, I feel that precious little is being said about our position in the rest of the world 12 years after 9/11. Why would I call it While America Sleeps? That's the name of the book. Well, it's a takeoff on a book that I thought was written by Winston Churchill prior to World War II. It turns out it was a series of speeches that Churchill gave in the floor of the House of Commons as the opposition leader, compiled by his son. And in these speeches, Churchill is gradually warning the British government and the other European countries that the rearmament and rebuilding in Germany was a very serious problem. That it was not simply bringing Germany back to be a healthy country, but an ambition well beyond it. He spoke of the fact that people on Downing Street didn't seem to understand that the position of the country could change. One of the quotes from one of the speeches I found sort of reminiscent of how I feel about our reaction on 9/11 and after. He said, "We must remember that we are for the time being no longer entirely masters of our own fate." He says of Britain at the time, "We are an undefeated people. Nearly 1,000 years have passed since we were subjugated by external force. All our outlook for several generations has been influenced by a sense of invincible security at home." Churchill continues, "That security is no longer absolute or certain, and we must address our minds courageously, seriously, to the new conditions under which we now have to dwell." My sense is that many people in this country, and our traditions are such, that because of these great oceans, because of our separation from the rest of the world, sometimes we lull ourselves into not taking seriously threats, whether they can be terrorist or economic or political. We tend to think, okay, we're glad that thing over there is done. Let's get back to doing our things here in the United States. And surely this was one of the problems on 9/11. I remember the summer, but prior to 9/11, you probably do as well. It was a very quiet summer. The biggest news story was there were a lot of shark attacks across the world, or they said it was. There were a lot of shark attacks. I thought maybe it was a slow news summer, so they noticed there were a lot of shark attacks. So it was called the Summer of the Shark. But then this thing happened, and it turned out that we were asleep at the switch. There were other warning signs. As you know, in 1998, there were the simultaneous bombings of our embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. Very unusual thing. In fact, there was to be a third one that day in Kampala in Uganda, but it was thwarted. And then the attack on the USS Cole in Aden Harbor in Yemen I happened to be in Fox News studio when that news came over, and I remember really feeling a chill. You know, somebody actually just drove a boat straight into one of our ships, killing 17 of our sailors, including one from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. I think the thing that probably most shook me, though, was a threat by the Taliban to go and destroy those giant Buddhas in Bamiyan. I remember thinking, I saw that news story, I thought, I know these people are kind of wild and that they're very out of control, but they're not going to do that. They're not going to blow that up. Hitler didn't even blow up the Oxford colleges in St. Paul's. And then they went ahead and did it. And I remember part of me is trying to say there's something going on here that's more than the normal local conflict. But what was probably the most telling in the long run was that I happened to be in a place called Kano, Nigeria, on a foreign relations trip in early 2001. And Kano is a city of about 2 million people. It's one of the largest Islamic cities in the world. It's been there for thousands of years along the Islamic trade routes. And we went up there really to talk about other things, but on the street there, my staff member and I noticed that kids in early 2001 didn't just have posters and photographs and t-shirts of Muammar Gaddafi, they also had them of bin Laden. And you probably have your iPhone, so take a look at how far that is from Afghanistan. It's really far. And I said to my staff member, Michelle, when we get back, I'm wondering a little bit about this. Could you get me a classified briefing on Al-Qaeda in this part of the world? She said, sure, I'll do whatever I can. You may have heard that things go slowly in Washington sometimes. That is true. The briefing was scheduled for September 13th, 2001. So needless to say, it never actually happened. Now, having said that, and reminding you how we kind of got caught off guard, it was not inevitable that we would not stick together and stay disciplined on this after 9/11. We got off to a good start. I thought George Bush gave the best speech I've ever heard a president give a couple of weeks after 9/11 in the House chamber. It was very concise, it was very appropriate, it said the right things about the Islamic world and about our resolve to deal with the problem. It was a great speech. Now, Bill Clinton gave a lot of great speeches too, but they were really long. The one thing about Bush is he kept it brief. And it was good. And then Colin Powell led a very effective and measured effort to gradually and carefully get us into what we had to do in Afghanistan, lining up almost every Islamic country in the world, including some of those who had not agreed with us with regard to the first Gulf War. This was measured, thoughtful, and careful activity by the Bush administration. And then somehow, still inexplicably to me, the wheels came off. All of a sudden I started hearing people say they're thinking about invading Iraq. I honestly thought it was a joke when I first heard it. I heard the scurrilous claims that Saddam Hussein had been in cahoots with bin Laden, that they really worked together. And this is at the same time that George Bush was running around the country talking about this, but he was also saying in speeches similar in time that Al-Qaeda was operating in some 60 countries in the world. He would say that. So I looked at the list on the State Department website. There are a lot of countries on this list. There was like Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Turkey, Great Britain, Ireland, the United States. Guess what country wasn't on this whole darn list? Iraq. Wasn't even on the list. So ridiculous and off the tracks it was. And in my book, since you're giving people copies, I recommend that you read the chapter that talks about how things seemed different in Washington psychologically. And I think led to this partly because of the anthrax attack, the barriers there, the DC sniper, all this stuff created an environment where I think people kind of lost their judgment in voting for something like this that frankly didn't make sense. As I told some people at Stanford Law School the other day when I'm teaching, the way the CIA talked about this thing in private classified briefings was very different from what you're hearing on TV. They clearly weren't buying that it was necessary to do this. And frankly, many senators of both parties knew this and went ahead and did it anyway. Remember, since I am very eager to not appear partisan unless it's necessary, it was a Democrat United States Senate that voted for this war. A majority of the Democrats voted for this war. So it's no free pass for the Democratic Party with regard to this, but certainly the principal blame goes to the Bush administration. So what happened then? Well, because we made this decision to go into Iraq, there's sort of this after-the-fact need to justify doing it, even though it didn't seem to fit with what was going on. We thought we were going after bin Laden. So what I've tried to compare it to in the book is a game that many of you, I think, know, the game of Risk. I'm always relieved when people much younger than I am know what I'm talking about. And apparently, when I talk about the Shell Answer Man, basically, yeah, it's like this. Nobody knows what that is. It was an ad from like 100 years ago. But Risk, thank God you know what it is. And one of the rules in Risk is that when you take over a country, when you're trying to take over the world, you've got to leave some of your troops there through the whole game. You can never take them all out. They just stay there. And you tend to operate on a country-by-country basis, not looking systemically or at the interconnections between places and peoples, but thinking in this old mentality of one country at a time. Okay, first it's Afghanistan. Okay, now we got that going. Now we're going to do Iraq. Next it's Yemen, instead of thinking about the world and organizations like Al-Qaeda the way they really are. Let's compare it to another game, Scrabble. My mother was really good at Scrabble. She could clobber me at it. But the best player I ever played was a guy who sublet an apartment for me in Madison when I was an undergraduate, one of those summers of the Watergate scandal. And we had nothing in common. He was like a 45-year-old biochemist from Taiwan. And he didn't understand what we were doing with this thing. He was in science, I was just in politics and history. So there wasn't a lot of common ground. But what Rudolph and we finally said to me was, Russ, do you play Scrabble? I said, sure. And he goes, all right, let's play. Well, he just clobbered me. He got the 7-word score every single time. Finally, I said in frustration, how do you do that? He said, you must always think in 2 directions. You have to always think in 2 directions. And the recent controversies you've seen in North Africa, which I wrote about in the book a couple years ago, illustrate that if you just think about one country at a time, whether it be Kenya or Somalia, or you want to think about Yemen, 20 miles across the water, you're not going to get it. Because a lot of this recent trouble came out of Algeria. But it didn't occur in Algeria. It occurred in Mali. A group called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Yes, they're Algerians, but they're not just Algerians. They are 3,000 people that went to Afghanistan in the late 80s and early 90s to be trained, to be mujahideen, with people like bin Laden. Then they came home as a group to radicalize certain people in Algeria and wage a 10-year war against the Algerian government, and they responded excessively. So they pushed them out. Where'd they go? They went to places like southern Algeria and Mali. And all this stuff that happened in Mali is directly related to it. If you only think about one country at a time, you won't get it. And we'll never be ahead of the thing. We'll always be trying to figure out after the fact, first, where is this place? And secondly, why is this happening? So that's a concern about the international position. We also made a series of errors post 9/11 that I categorize and talk about in the book as exploiting the terrorist threat that we experience for domestic political purposes, not to make ourselves safe. This includes the USA Patriot Act. I was the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act because I read it. It's not a novel thing to do. I can't tell you I read every bill, but I was the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee. So I thought maybe I ought to take a look at this thing. And when I read it, I realized that there were a bunch of provisions thrown in there by our law enforcement and other people that they never would have had passed before that really weren't all that related to terrorism. For example, being able to get at your library records just on the say-so of an agent or a U.S. government without, and a judge just basically has no discretion to say no. Something called sneak and peek searches of people's houses when you're not home. Seems to be against the Fourth Amendment, what the government has done on certain occasions. They claim this was needed for terrorism purposes. 2 years later, we got a report. Oh, it had been used a ton, but not once for terrorism. It's for drug use. So, as Bob Novak, the late CNN conservative commentator, said, this was an old wish list of the FBI that could have been taken out of the bill because much of the rest of the bill had merit. So it was exploited for that purpose. Our Constitution was exploited by the Bush administration. Under Cheney and John Yoo, they basically said, hey, this is a war on terror. The White House and the executive can ignore the law of the land. The law, not just the bill, but our laws against warrantless wiretapping without court approval, and our laws against torture. It isn't even the enormous merit of those issues alone. This is a different constitution. This violates Justice Jackson's great test in the steel seizure case, which is if Congress and the country have spoken, the power of the executive to disregard that law, even in time of war, is absolutely minimal. Now, I was not shocked to see George Bush do that, but I will say, as much as I like this president, I was co-chair of his campaign, he needs to actually repudiate this doctrine much more clearly, or it will be baked into the Constitution when two presidents do it. Another problem that's become worse in the last couple of years, and was not a problem for many years, is the way in which Muslim Americans and Arab Americans are characterized in this country. I thought President Bush and Attorney General Ashcroft did a wonderful job of discouraging this kind of conduct. And you can ask members of the Muslim and Arab American community, they feel that for many years after 9/11, this was surprisingly well handled in this country, to our credit. In the last couple of years, though, we've had everything from Koran burnings to people becoming incredibly wound up at the idea of a mosque in southern Manhattan, where there's everything. There's churches, there's synagogues, there's grocery stores, there's strip joints. You know, having a house of worship that happens to be the same religion in theory of the people that did this attack really should not be something that people should have that kind of reaction to. And it's such a hurtful thing to the law-abiding and loyal Muslim Americans. Probably the worst example, though, was the hearings that were held by Representative King of New York, where he wanted to target just Muslim extremism in the United States. That was the topic. And, you know, it's one thing to talk about violence. It's one thing to talk about, you know, people doing things like this. We still have no idea who did this thing in Boston, although maybe there's reports now. I don't know if it's domestic or foreign. But to have a hearing that's targeted at one particular group in this way was hurtful. And you know who were the first people to protest against it in this country? Japanese Americans, who remembered Korematsu, who remembered the detention camps, and remembered what it felt like to have an assumption of disloyalty directed their way. So these are some of the things that I think were directed in a mistaken way that we still need to correct. But perhaps the most recent, and the one that you would relate to very well, is what I call sort of the trivializing of American foreign policy for political purposes. And we saw a lot of that last year, in the last couple of years. But one of the things that, on the right in particular, they have this thing about how Barack Obama spent all his time in his first term running around the world apologizing for America. Romney had a book about this. If you look at what he actually said, you don't see the word apology. He'd say things like, you know, we might have done a better job here. It's just being mature and diplomatic. Another thing that has gone on is sort of taking political pot shots at presidential foreign trips. You know, we didn't used to do that. When John F. Kennedy went to Berlin, all Americans took pride when he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." When Richard Nixon went to China, I was a freshman at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I wanted nothing more than to have Nixon defeated. But when he went there and made that initiative, we all praised him. There weren't cheap shots. And when Ronald Reagan said to Mr. Gorbachev, "Tear down this wall," I don't remember people politicizing that. We were together. What happens when Barack Obama goes to India? You know, India is kind of an important place. Good place to go. Fox News goes after him, saying he took too much security there. Yeah. You kind of need some security there. And then when he and Michelle did a traditional dance with people in that country in a village out of respect, it was mocked as being inappropriate. We've lost something when this is the way we treat our presidents who are trying to represent us overseas. And then finally, the thing that the Republican presidential candidates all had to say to be considered was that they had to say that they believed in, quote, American exceptionalism. Now, I believe in American exceptionalism. I still think this is the greatest country in the world. But what do you really get by just saying that over and over again? How do you think that sounds to the ears? I've been in cars in Italy with British and Italian people who think their countries have done a few things too. You know, they've accomplished a few things over the years. This isn't good. This kind of battering ram, instead of having a thoughtful, friendly approach to other countries, is heard in a very bad way. It's like my mom used to say to me. If you go to the playground and brag, the kids aren't going to like it. And really, there is a lot of this in the way we've handled this instead of moving in a different direction. So, obviously, the blame goes all around. My concern is that we turn this around. I think we still can. I even heard this administration sort of proclaiming that we had already decimated Al-Qaeda and they were done, and I was concerned that that was premature because it was premature. The threats are real. That doesn't mean we should be immobilized, but we need to be concerned about places like Northern Africa. We need to be concerned about other kinds of threats. Economic competition. What are the Chinese doing in Africa? What are the Iranians doing in South Africa? What is our relationship with Russia now, which isn't getting enough attention? We can't just let those sit for 20 years and then come back to them and say, gee, we probably should have paid attention. Let me take the example that I began with, that of Nigeria. This city in northern Nigeria called Kano. I learned in the last couple of years there's an organization in that part of the area called Boko Haram. It means no more Western education. They pulled off about 200 bombings that are becoming more and more sophisticated, and there's evidence that they are associated with other groups that are probably linked to Al-Qaeda chapters, both in Africa and in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is very reminiscent of 9/11, where we tended to discount it, the things that were happening in Afghanistan, because we really didn't have a clear sense of where it was. So what do? Well, there's a few things we can do. First, we can figure out where these places are. When I was teaching at Marquette University Law School, I picked up a copy of the college newspaper, the Marquette Tribune, and a young man had written a little column during the Arab Spring. It's a good column. The name of it was, "Where in the World is Tunisia?" He said, "I'm a pretty good student. I thought I knew what important countries there were, which ones there weren't, which ones are our allies." He said, "I didn't know." He said, "Why is it that we know more about Kardashian than we do about Kyrgyzstan?" I quoted him in the book, and he just found out he was down in Argentina or something. His parents finally got him the word that his column was quoted. But I thought it was symbolic of something we all share. When I went on the Foreign Relations Committee and became a member of the Africa Subcommittee, I didn't know where most of the countries in Africa were. I was 39 years old. We need to learn foreign languages. My mother, I keep mentioning her, but she was quite a lady. She knew 5 languages fluently. I thought, I don't need this. What a mistake. It's dangerous for our country to not be able to understand both what our friends say and potentially our enemies, and people that we want to do business with. So finally somebody said to me, "You've been giving this speech, Russ, for 2 years. When are you going to learn language?" And my excuse was, "Oh, I'm 60 years old. It's really hard at this age," but it finally wore me down. So I actually started taking Spanish last week with these Stanford freshmen who are destroying me. But I'm trying, because this is so important to our country. Finally, all of us, I think, could do more, and the government could help us become ambassadors to the rest of the world as private citizens. My favorite example of this is a dairy farmer in Wisconsin who came to me many years ago. Damon Szymanski was his name. He's from Pulaski, Wisconsin, which is near Lambeau Field. The great Packers. And he's a dairy farmer. And he came to me and he said, "Russ, I just want you to know there's a little government program called VOCA, Volunteers Overseas." He said, "I went to a dairy farm in one of the former Soviet republics, and I saw how they were doing their milk processing." He said, "and there was so much bacteria in the milk, it could probably walk the market by itself." A dairy joke in Wisconsin. And I thought that was funny, but here's the thing. He helped them out. He comes back 10 years later. He had been to 30 other countries doing this. We should all do stuff like this. By the way, I learned something here today. This college, 57%, I hope I got the figure right, 57% of your students spend a semester or more overseas. One of the top figures in the nation This is the kind of leadership that we need to prepare our country for the future. So let me conclude by just going back to that original reason why I called this book While America Sleeps, after Churchill's book, While England Slept. There was another book written not long after Churchill's publication was published. It was sort of a response to While England Slept. It was written by an undergraduate at Harvard College, a senior who was doing his senior thesis. And he was kind of connected, so he was able to get that senior thesis published commercially. A lot of you might not be able to do that right away, but hang in there. His dad was pretty powerful, so he got that done. And this is what John F. Kennedy had to say. We cannot escape the fact that democracy in America, like democracy in England, has been asleep at the switch. He said, to say that democracy has been awakened by the events of the last few weeks is not enough. Any person will awaken when the house is burning down. What we need is an armed guard that will wake up when the first fire starts, or better yet, one that will not permit a fire to start at all. So that's the end of that part of the presentation. Now I'm going to try to switch into campaign finance for 5 minutes, as requested. Fair enough, or are we over time? All right. Citizens United decision is not just any decision. If you believe that it's money in politics, it's always been like that, there's just one key fact. If you don't know it already, I want you to know. Corporations and unions in this country have not been allowed to use their treasuries, that is the money they get when you buy a tube of toothpaste or a gallon of gas, or if you're a union member when you pay your dues, they have not been allowed to use that money for political campaigns since 1907 under the Tillman Act signed by Teddy Roosevelt, and since 1947 for unions. Unquestioned law for 100 years or more. Supreme Court, after we managed to pass McCain-Feingold, after we had the internet get involved, after people felt empowered at a grassroots level and we were beginning to actually solve this problem, 5 members of the Supreme Court decided to overturn those laws. So for the first time, corporations can use unlimited and often undisclosed contributions to devastate our political process. Now, the group we formed, Progressives United, is dedicated to getting that overturned. It can be overturned by one vote. I think it will be overturned. The question is 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years, and what is the devastation to our system? We can require disclosure of campaign contributions. That same court that made this awful, lawless decision actually said by an 8-to-1 vote that of course you should have disclosure. Scalia made fun of the idea that you wouldn't have disclosure. And yet the Republicans in the Senate refused to pass the Disclose Act. If we can disclose what's going on, which I guarantee you isn't pretty, people in private conversations asking for unlimited funds with no limit. In the Midwest we say, and I heard somebody say it here today, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, maybe tonight there was. But I tell you this, there is no such thing as a free $10 million contribution. I'm pretty sure about that. This is corrupt. It will explode. It will hurt the politicians and the companies that are playing the game. And it is one of the great issues of our time that both parties have gone to the tank to not challenge. We all must challenge it together. And so I have tried to make the transition between the two subjects, and we'll leave it at that. Thanks. And we'll do, thank you very much. Do a couple of questions if you like. Yes. Well, it was not literal control as far as I know, but there was a groupthink sort of thing going on in this country. Sort of post 9/11, we don't want to get surprised again. And it felt like both people in the public generally, but especially those in leadership positions, sort of felt like they didn't want to be the one that had it wrong this time. That maybe it's true that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were working together. So there was this huge benefit of the doubt that went in the direction of sort of believing absurd claims of that regard. I mean, I did see some letters of the editor against the Iraq War, but I can tell you that in Wisconsin, even though I voted against it, at the time of my vote, the majority were for the war. But they turned on that thing so fast. And one of the quotes I've given here is a soldier came up to me after a town meeting. He was in uniform and he did not speak at the town meeting. And I thought, well, he's going to give me a piece of his mind. He came over to me, this is just before the Iraq War, and he said, Senator, I'm ready to die for my country, but it doesn't add up. He knew. We all knew. But there was a groupthink going on that somehow led to one of the worst foreign policy mistakes we've ever made. Yes?
What are the approaches you see that might be a positive result?
Getting rid of Citizens United is a multi-tier issue. First, we have to make sure the public understand this isn't the way it always was. You know, people think, it's money in politics, what are they going to do? People that have contributed to politicians know. There used to be, you could call somebody up and say, you can give me up to $2,000 to be for a United States Senate race. Not, how would you like to do $250,000? How would you like to do $500,000? So one of the things I'm doing is I'm meeting with a lot of the top business groups in the country, and they're very interested in this. Because the real fall guys of our system are becoming the corporations and the wealthy. They are being subjected to essentially a syndicate, where they're not protected by the laws and they can be asked for anything. What do you do if you're a company and your competitor's doing this and you're not? So that's part of how we do persuade people that this is serious. There are litigation strategies that we're pursuing to get a challenge before the Supreme Court. Of course, getting Obama nominees through, I believe, will help if those vacancies occur. People say, well, you know, their people are in better health than our people. And now I can say, they don't have to go that way. I mean, even the Pope quit, right? They can quit. Souter did that. So, you know, let's be ready. But in the meantime, pass the state laws. New York's trying to take it, the wonderful city of New York public financing, make it statewide. Get Cuomo to do that. In California, there are 2 votes short of passing disclosure laws that are so important on those referenda. You should see the ads on those referenda. You know, it's the family-friendly people trying to help your lives. Now, of course, it's the insurance industry or the pharmaceutical companies. There's no requirement of disclosure. So you can do this across the country, and that's exactly what our group is trying to do. Yes, sir.
One argument against Citizens United was made that they say corporations are people, but corporations are owned. And you try to have, if they're owned, that makes them slaves, and the 13th Amendment doesn't allow.
Well said. Some of the people that are talking about a constitutional amendment want to amend the 13th Amendment, or the 14th Amendment on terms of personhood in this regard. But you know, corporations are simply creatures of the state. They're not human beings. You have to be chartered by state government. You could have a law saying no corporations. And it was really funny that after this decision, even though they made up this malarkey about how, you know, they should have the same political rights, Chief Justice Roberts issued an opinion a couple weeks later where AT&T company was saying that they had a right to privacy. And he made fun of it. So they're not really people, they don't have a right to privacy. Well, then why do they have the right to do this? Why can't they vote? I think there was a guy here in Maryland who was going to run as McDonald's as a candidate. There was a guy in the HOV lane recently who was pulled over because he was by himself. He said, he had some corporation papers. It's an absurdity. And that's why I think the decision will be overturned. Yes?
With respect to foreign policy, how do you feel that the Obama administration's reaction to the threats by the leaders of North Korea?
I think they've done a pretty measured job at this point. It has got to be one of the most difficult things anyone's ever had to do, and every administration's been bedeviled by. I think there was some hope that this younger guy would be a little more rational. He appears to be a little more aware of the rest of the world. But his behavior, the hope is his behavior is just to show his mettle for whoever really runs the show over there, as opposed to actually being willing to do something frightful. But the administration has to be ready, and I believe they are ready to take whatever step is necessary to prevent them from going any farther. And that's very difficult to say, but this is exceedingly dangerous. But I do not feel that they've made a mistake at this point. I think they will have to seriously consider positive incentives as not being so easy this time. That did not work, and we have to be careful not to be taken to the cleaners on that. Yes?
Regarding the gun control bill that got shot down by the lack of getting the filibuster, is there any strategy that might work to renege on the filibuster rule?
Well, you know, one of the course I've been teaching at the law schools I've been at is about the U.S. Senate as a legal institution. We talk a lot about the filibuster. It was disappointing to not see some serious reform in the filibuster rule. It failed this year, despite the best efforts. You should know the reason is there weren't 51 Democratic votes to do it. It wasn't the 60 votes. Now, part of that's because the people who've been in the Senate like I have believed that it has a role. I'm glad the proposal was not to bring it down from 60. The proposal was simply to say, you have to talk. You know, you can't just do the silent filibuster. Now that should have been adopted and could have been adopted. The stealth filibuster has not existed until 1975, when Mike Mansfield, the great majority leader from Montana, got frustrated with filibusters, so he created a two-tier track where you could have a filibuster but move on to something else later. Well, the trouble is that created the silent filibuster. So getting 51 or 60 votes to do that, I think, is a much-needed reform. And given, you know, when the filibuster wasn't used for everything, when I first got to the Senate, it was very unusual. I was telling people tonight at the reception that I once made Senator Mikulski angry with me, and that's not a wise idea, because she was trying to pass a bill on housing, and I did my famous cheese filibuster. They were trying to take away some rights of Wisconsin dairy farmers, so my staff got me a bunch of recipe books and the history of cheese. And I started reading the history of cheese. And she said, how long is the senator going to do that? And I said, until this thing's out of the bill. She goes, okay, we'll take it out. I only did it once, okay? I did it for my state. Not every single bill for partisan reasons. That's an abuse. And that's what we need to change. Students? We have a student, Wayne back. Yes.
So my father recently was affected by the event that is known as the sequester. And as everyone knows, that was something that was set up to be an event that was so catastrophic it would force Congress to vote on a budget reform instead of allowing this event to happen. Do you believe that Congress going on recess just before the sequester was supposed to come into effect was because of bipartisanship, or do you think it was just because the senators were lazy?
It was more partisanship than laziness. And the fact, you know, I'm a little biased on this one. I really believe the Tea Party approach of saying you can't raise taxes at a time of crisis to participate really blocks the way to getting other changes that maybe liberals or progressives want. So this should not have happened. It was not intended to happen. It was supposed to be resolved in the way you say, and sure, people should have stayed there. Instead, for those in the House that played it primarily as Tea Party constituencies, they love this. And you see, they're only concerned about that district usually, which doesn't reflect the view of the majority of the people in the country. That really distorts it. It's a very serious problem. Somebody in the back there? All right, sir. One more after this. I'll do one more after this one. Yeah.
Okay, so I know everyone's talked about with Citizens United how horrible this all is, but in 2012, like Sheldon Allison spent millions of dollars that won no one election, and Karl Rove, I think, had less than 1% success rate. So with those statistics, like, is this real? How big of a problem really is this?
Well, that's really the most important comment that you can make about this. If your paradigm or your view is, oh, we won anyway, which is what every consultant in Washington is saying to the Democrats, this is a good thing for the Democrats, you know, to have corporations give unlimited contributions. We won. Well, it's mind shaking. And the truth is that it isn't just about who wins or who loses. It's about corruption. It's about the fact that both sides are bought off. It's after the election. It's about what happened with soft money. trade agreements that shipped our jobs overseas didn't pass 52-48. It passed 85-15. The gutting of independence in our media in the Telecommunications Act of 1996 passed 95-5. What were Democrats doing voting for consolidating all these independent radio stations into Clear Channel? Both sides were bought off, and probably the greatest example for all of us. You know, there was a little law called Glass-Steagall that said, let's not let banks and investment houses merge. Oh, great idea. Both sides at the trough for Wall Street campaign contributions. That stuff's old news. Let's get rid of it. 90-10. Because both sides were bought off. That's what you have now. So that the election really doesn't matter when it comes to these issues, because on the day after the election, Exxon and BP and all these are taken care of. Because neither side's willing to take them on. So I do think the election part is important, but I think what happens after the election is even more important. Great question. That's the message I want to get out more than anything else about this subject, so thanks for asking it. Thanks so much. It's great to be here at Gettysburg College.